यज्ञस्य देवं रत्विजम्.
Hi, welcome to our stream. Today we have a very special guest, Rasmus Bjørn, also known as also Danes on Twitter. He's a historical linguist. He has a PhD from the Max Planck Institute in historical linguistics. He also did master's and bachelor's from University of Copenhagen, Denmark. He is very active on Twitter. He gives his viewpoints on various issues pertaining to historical linguistics. And today, Rasmus, is that the right pronunciation of your name?
Yeah, perfect.
So I just want to know, how did you come into historical linguistics? This is such an esoteric field that, that is just such a, it's not mainstream. People go into banking, engineering. Like, what attracted you to this field?
Certainly not the money, no. Right, yeah. Well, it was roundabout ways, I guess, as for most people. I went to an international school, and that meant I was subjected to a lot of different languages, a lot of languages I didn't understand, but still I could see that there are, systems that I could recognize without understanding the language. And once I was trying to figure out what I wanted to study, I heard about that in Copenhagen. We had a course called Indo-European Studies, and I read about it. It was all about, well, you really, really, really need to like grammar. But if you like grammar, this is for you. It's like, okay. And then I started looking into it, and then I got hooked. And it was from the start, it was just really fascinating that there were all these regularities between languages that I think most people already recognize, but they don't understand how to obviously scrutinize it, because that's a whole field in and by itself. But as I got further into it, it was clear that there was a huge passion of mine. And in my master's studies, I realized that I also had something to contribute myself beyond just redoing what other people have been doing before me.
So Rasmus also has papers published. He also has papers that are in progress, like under review and so on. You can find him on academia. I will put a link to his academia in the description section. So, those of you who are, nerdy enough to pursue that, you can look at it and see how he thinks and what he's contributed. So Rasmus, I'm assuming you speak, as a linguist, you're Danish, so you speak English and Danish pretty fluently, right? Do you speak any other languages fluently?
I guess the next one in line now is Faroese, because my wife is from the Faroe Islands. I speak some German, I speak some Spanish, but I always feel like I'm disappointing everyone by saying that I don't know that many languages, while on the other hand, I'm technically working with the history of at least 1,500 across 7 or 8 different language families. So I obviously rely on the expertise of other people, other linguists, and it just goes to show how complex a field it is, historical linguistics, because you rely on the expertise of so many different people. So yeah, I'm not fluent in very many languages, but I can read a good handful, again, of the European languages, because that's where most of the literature written in, the scientific literature is written. Yeah.
Right. So Danish is a very fascinating language to me because it has so many vowels. It's very hard for anyone to act like a native speaker. You have that phrase, right? You can test to see if someone is a Danish or not. Like it's like flick or something, right?
You know what it is? It's rødgrød med fløde.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah. Og rødøl.
It's pretty fascinating language. So, as we know, there is no good introduction to historical linguistics in video format. So I've asked Rasmus to kindly go ahead and go with the with the introduction, and then we'll have a discussion where we're going to grill him properly to make sure he knows what he's talking about. Go ahead, Rasmus. Go ahead with the presentation.
All right. Well, I don't know if this is going to meet the standards. They're going to be the good introduction to historical linguistics online. But first of all, I just want to thank you for the invitation, because we've had wonderful discussions on Twitter. So why not do it in person, an actual live chat? So basically, what I'm presenting here is the bare bone introduction that I'm presenting in an introduction to my dissertation, which has been submitted, and I'm now just waiting for my defense within the next couple of months down in Germany. Because why am I writing a very introduction to historical linguistics if this is a PhD level? Well, that's because my dissertation is aimed not just as historical linguist, but also archaeologist, a geneticist, because the field of prehistory, if we want to study prehistory, we need to understand where we're all coming from and what we're basing our science on. So that's also what I'm trying to promote on Twitter, that, well, from my perspective, it starts and ends with the linguistic argument, but in order to fit that into the prehistoric landscape, we need to look at archaeology and genetics. And obviously, I'm not an expert in that. Just like I said, I'm not an expert in all the different language families. So I'm just here to try to gather all the data and see how it all fits together. And we do that best together by having a conversation like this. So that's the point I just made, specifically the uncontroversial language family. So it's completely uncontroversial that Indo-European is a language family. We can reconstruct Proto-Indo-European, but nothing within that purely linguistic comparative exercise tells us where that proto-language was spoken. But we do have some clear ideas of at least how old it must have been, and then we can discuss, like, it must have been earlier than the earliest attestations in Hittite and in ancient Greek. The question is, how much earlier is it then? And those are the parameters that we can discuss, of course. Right. So basically, what is language based on? Well, that's based on how we pronounce different words, and we have different sounds, and there are systems to that. So it's systematic. It's not just random comparisons that we do. The whole foundation is that there are regular correspondences, and we'll look into that. But just as looking at English, actually the written English language is hopeless in the sense of introducing anybody to linguistics, because when we write an E, we actually say the sound that we in the International Phonetic Alphabet would write as I, because there have been sound changes in English. So that's quite hopeless. So 150 years ago, they agreed here in Europe, of course, because that's where Europeans were doing science back then, on the International Phonetic Alphabet. So that has a specific definition for each sound. And that's how languages basically function, with contrast between sounds. No language in the world uses all the different sounds for meaningful contrast, but in principle, we can all say them. But it depends on which language that you use, what languages contrast each other. So the bare bone introduction here is that we have these lists of cognates. How do we find out that they're cognates within a language family? Well, that's because there are regular correspondences between them. So this is a list, and again, I'm sorry for this is Indo-European, but I guess we'll be discussing Indo-European mostly anyway, so it's a good place to start, is that we can see, and it was noticed a very long time ago, more than 200 years ago, that there was, every time a word in the Germanic languages would start with an F, it would correspond to words beginning with a P in Latin, Greek, Baltic, and Sanskrit. So just based on that, there was a regular correspondence between those sounds with the same meaning, and obviously also the rest of the sounds in the words. But now we're just looking at the initial here. In order to figure out what came first, like did a P come from an F or did an F come from a P? We can see that there are several other developments. So we can see further down on the tree, we can see that German further developed T into its set. So we see that in Zahn as compared to tooth. So tooth. And you can see that the rest of the Indo-European branches outside of Germanic, they all have a D in that position. And here I'm also introducing on the other side of the line that there's a different language that does not belong to this, because there's no regularity within these words. And that's the Finnish language here, which belongs to the Uralic language family. I'm using that for contact examples later. But what this gives us is a relative chronology. And the importance of that is that it's relative. We can see that these languages are related to each other, and one development must have happened before the other. Like we saw here with the development of D to T must have happened in Germanic before German then developed the T further to the Z sound, sound. but we don't know when that happened, not within just the purely linguistic evidence. So that means it's kind of like a spring. So it could be 10,000 years of developments, or it could be 5,000 years of development. The only thing that we get from the purely comparative linguistic comparison is the order of these developments. And then we can start calibrating these different language families by looking at words that are borrowed into other language families. So like we saw specifically with the Germanic language family, the Germanic branch of Indo-European is defined by these sound developments that I pointed to earlier. We can also see that there are certain developments within from Proto-Indo-European to Sanskrit. And some of these developments we can see in loanwords in the Uralic language family. Again, this doesn't tell us exactly when, but it tells us that these two language families were in contact at certain points in time, significantly after Proto-Indo-European and after what later becomes Sanskrit underwent these developments. And specifically with Finnish again, and the Uralic language family, we can see that there are early borrowings that are that we can see across a lot of different branches of Uralic that have these developments that we know from Sanskrit, which is the Indo-Iranic branch of Indo-European. But there are also particularly in the Finnish branch, or like the Balto-Finnic branch, there are loanwords that shows that they have come. Loanwords that betray that they have come from the Germanic branch. So we can see here that there are, speech communities, the languages have been moving around and coming into contact with each other at different points in time. Again, this is a blank slate. This is just looking at linguistic evidence. And that's what I mean by we'll start with linguistic evidence and we'll end with linguistic evidence. And in the meantime, we'll try to put it into the prehistoric landscape that we're learning so much more about basically every week with every new publication in genetics and archaeology. But this is the linguistic background. So what we then, if you look at Indo-European, and this is something that's been criticized a lot, and I agree with the criticism, but it's still there. So it's something we need to discuss, because we can reconstruct words for cow, horse, and sheep for Proto-Indo-European. But what kind of a cow, what kind of a horse, and what kind of a sheep, that's the big question. So those are the positives that we have. We don't know if they also had a word for goat. We cannot reconstruct the word for goat. So that's something we can discuss. Was there so we can look at places where there were goats and then say that they lost that word for goat. But we can't look at places where they would have had no idea what a cow was. That's really difficult to explain. We can try. And then we can see which hypothesis works best, of course. And specifically with the horse, if we don't get into it, like just within the past 10 years, we've learned so much where it's been clear that the early ideas about how like the role of the horse within earliest Proto-Indo-European society is different from what it must have been, because we've learned about when the horse was probably domesticated. And that's certainly downstream from when Proto-Indo-European must have been spoken in whatever hypothesis that fits. So we're really learning a lot and recontextualizing the linguistic evidence. So, and that's only because we're integrating new evidence and points of criticism from basically everywhere. So, and this doesn't just go for Indo-European. Indo-European has the word for cow, you can see, but the Uralic language family also exists somewhere in this Eurasian landscape. So does Yeniseian, but we have very little. They're not widely branched, so we basically just have one language left, and we have some historical attestations of other languages, but they're very close together. So it's difficult to get a very deep signal on that. Turkic is kind of intermediary. We believe that it spread roughly 500 BC. That's the early branching event there. And we know that they had a word for horse, which meant at. And of course, by then, and what we also know historically from the Turkic languages is that was most likely a very domesticated horse. And then for Sino-Tibetan languages in the east of Eurasia, well, we can't really reconstruct much pastoral vocabulary. So here we have the reconstruction for the word for tree. So it's very different from the different language families. But all of these need to be fitted. And this is the linguistic evidence, again, that I'll start with and then we end with, because all of these needs to be fitted with the calibration points onto this prehistoric map that we're trying to fill out together. I want to make a point about substrate and superstrate, because that's also a very telltale sign about language dynamics in prehistory, and we'll probably get into it. So a superstrate is where you can see, like, so in my visualization here, which I took for my dissertation, is that the white is an incoming language or an incoming language group. And with a superstrate, it comes in, but then it disappears again, but we can still see the effects on the language that's been there throughout. And that's basically with Norman, the Norman French in England, roughly, well, some 800 or almost 1,000 years ago now. They were introduced, and there was an aristocracy, the aristocrats, they were in the elite in the society, and they borrowed a lot of words, but they didn't change the language. Like they didn't shift the language to French. They kept speaking English, but the English that we speak today is full of loan words from this Norman French. And we can reverse it when we go to India in the past couple of centuries, where English is now spoken in India. Of course, all the languages of the subcontinent are still there, or most of them at least. But we can see that there's effect on the English that's spoken there, specifically with the retroflex sounds. So there we can see the substrate effect. And the substrate effect tells us that these people used to speak a different language with a different set of contrasts. And in English, it doesn't matter if you use retroflex sounds, because it doesn't change the meaning. It's not a set of contrasts that they use in English. So therefore, it doesn't change our understanding of the language. And we can see that as a telltale sign of English not always being spoken in the subcontinent, and that there's a difference between the English spoken in Britain and the English spoken in India. So yeah, that's basically my general introduction. That's what we can get from linguistic evidence, and what we need to be able to explain once we try to plot it into this prehistoric landscape. And this is my dissertation. It's called Eurasia Connected. And the reason why I called it that is not just because the Bronze Age setting, and also even into the Neolithic and certainly into the Iron Age, is that Eurasia was connected. So all these language groups were interacting in very many different ways, and we need to try to find these calibration points. My point is also that we need to connect together as researchers and people who are interested in this, and have an honest discussion about this, because we know different things. We have different data points that we bring to the table. The interpretation is very much up to all of us, and let's do it in a civil manner, and respect that we're all just curious about this prehistory together. So what I'll be presenting in my dissertation, which hopefully should come out as a book as well, is that here are all these linguistic data points for 15 different domesticated crops and animals that we know spread between the Neolithic into the Iron Age, and to see that some of these words were borrowed and how they affected each other, the different language families. We can try to switch them around to see, well, which hypothesis fits best. So while we'll be discussing Indo-European, there are roughly 10 different branches. We don't need to agree on this. This is the best consensus view we have, but there are 10 different branches. So that's the important thing. What I want to show with this is that there are 10 different branches, and they all need to end up where they are being spoken, or at least historically where we know they have been. So that's also part of the linguistic data that we need to fit in there. And then we can discuss these. Okay, what are these branching events? When could they have happened? And I'd like also to say, I really, really appreciate also with the Hecate paper that came out recently, that maps are really nice because they're concrete. And we can then interrogate that. And this map, which is, I guess, obviously like based on the Steppe, like there are certainly things that we've learned since then that there have been tweaks to that as well, because there are questions constantly being asked about, well, how can we explain this or that, especially with Armenian. Perhaps we'll get into that at some point. Otherwise, I'll have to elaborate elsewhere. That, okay, they actually took a different route. There's evidence that they could have taken a different route into to the Armenian highlands. So all of that is changing, and that's what I think should characterize a good science, is that you're constantly probing at whatever is the consensus view. And I'm happy again to discuss any other hypothesis, because I'd love to see nothing more than Indo-European being like the consensus being completely overturned next year by some really cool discovery. And I know that there are a lot of things that we still need to account for. But yeah, this is my point of departure, because first of all, it's the consensus view that I've been probing at with these contact interfaces. And from what I can see, it still checks out, but I'm very happy to discuss everything and anything, basically. And I think that's the end of that. So let's just leave the map up here, because that's something to probe at.
Right. Thank you, Rasmus, for this introduction. So I'm going to ask basic questions that many people have asked me, and I have asked myself, and I haven't received, any satisfactory answer. The first question is, how long does it take for a language group to form? So the intent behind the question is, if you look at the hunter-gatherers or the pastoral people, their languages are traced to at the most 4,500 years. So in the Australian Aborigines have languages that are 4,500 years old. There are 150 languages. They're all, genetically similar people. Same with the Papua New Guinea. Same with the many Pacific Islands. Same with the, California, the Native American languages. They're all similar. They're, the genetically similar. They're living close to each other, but most of them speak isolates, right? And when they try to trace the similarity, or when they do the analysis on how old these languages are, it stops at 4,500. And my understanding is that in small groups of people, when the life expectancy is 35, 40, if you look at most of the burials of these people, they're around 35 years old. Okay, the language changes very, very fast, and all traceability stops at 4,500 years. They become isolates. So when you say language group formed, how does it form? How do you get this large number of people speaking related languages over a large space?
Right. Well, wonderful question. And there's obviously no fixed rate of how language change. So basically how quickly they form, and it relates to so many different social questions about social transformations. And I think that's what's quite unique about looking at this space from the Neolithic going into the Bronze Age, vis-a-vis hunter-gatherer societies. So just to take like classic examples is to look at Danish, which you just said, we have all these vowels, and that has happened quite quickly, because even Norwegians are having a harder time to understand what we're actually saying. And if you go further out to the Faroe Islands, where my wife is from, or to Iceland, you could see that they're more conservative. Why are they more conservative? Well, all other things equal, is because Denmark has been right in the middle, and you can see it up there, just in southern Scandinavia, connected to Germany, is that there's been a lot of influence from a lot of different people. And that's also why I wanted to introduce this idea about substrate interference, which has also been shown to have happened in Tocharian. It's been known since it was discovered roughly 100 years ago that the Tocharian language looks quite different from all the other Indo-European languages. It's clear that it's Indo-European because it follows regular sound laws, but that the system, the phonology is very different, and also especially the case system is very different. And it's been, again, within the past 5 years, researchers have shown that it looks like it's because it's overlain on a population that spoke an early Samoyedic or Yeniseic-like language. And that's exactly what we expect when these speakers spoke a different type of language, then started learning a second language where they already had their basic internal language system in place. So that happened fast. That kind of and what defines a language group vis-a-vis another? Well, it's defined by mutual intelligibility. So what becomes difficult for me is something I can't address directly, is this hunter-gatherer, because that's something I'm really, really fascinated by, but it's not anything my research has focused on. only in one example. I'll get to that. Because within this space of Eurasian prehistory, we're seeing just a lot of societal transformations, which are not hunter-gatherers anymore. We're seeing more complex societies. And I have a hypothesis that the word seven, as we speak it today in English, is actually a Wanderwort that spread at the onset of the Neolithic. As the Neolithic spread, there was this need for more complex numerals. Of course, people had been able to quantify these things before, but all of a sudden they become grammaticalized because there was a need for constant reference to higher numerals. I know 7 is not a higher numeral, but if you compare it to exactly hunter-gatherer societies, they often just have 1, 2, 3, many. And yes, you can quantify by saying a hand and 2, but that would be an ad hoc solution and not a grammaticalized numeral system. So
Okay,
just to round it up, just because I want to hold on to that hunter-gatherer point, because when we saw Afanasyevo, and that's one of my hypotheses as well, connected to this whole language contact, is that we can see in the Uralic and Turkic languages, and this article is out there in open access, is that from archaeology and genetics, we know that Afanasyevo brought the Bronze Age from Western Eurasia to Central Asia, and we don't even know. And just from the archaeological description, they describe how societal complexity is going up exactly because now there's a hierarchical society where before there were just hunter-gatherer populations. So there we probably see rapid changes in the languages of that region, and I believe that's the outcome of where Uralic and Turkic probably came from. Again, ballpark figures. Let's get into the details.
Right. No, my question was something else. Essentially, what happens when people group together, like two different populations come together?
Yes.
There's usually a Creole or and then the question is, it takes a while for a morphology to become uniform, for noun cases to become standardized, for conjugations to have the tenses, moods, and all of that to form. And this doesn't look like it can happen quick, So you have so you're saying it can take any time, but the changes you described are minor changes, borrowings of vowels, change in
languages can change really fast. And co-creolization is, again, one of the most fascinating things about historical linguistics. The big question is how relevant it was in prehistory. And I reiterate, a big question. I don't have an answer to that. What we know is we know Creole's happening. We know that happening, certainly, like the vast majority of them, or we know them well, is because of colonization, of this global trade, people being moved all over the place that have different languages, and all of a sudden they need to build a new one. So first they have pidgins, where they have this not a fully formed language basically, but they manage to communicate. But then the next generation that are born and speak in this pidgin will become a Creole, because they will. That's their language. That's their fully formed language. Trubetskoy, there is an old idea within that Proto-Indo-European was essentially a Creole, which is a possibility. So, but that's basically upstream from everything we're discussing in terms of how it spread. It's certainly something I've been quite interested in. I'm not sure I would call it a Creole, but that's okay. This is all about terminology, because that's why I basically just use the adstrate. So the substrate or superstrate, like people coming together, forming, figuring out how to communicate together. Usually one language wins out, but then with influences from the other. And we can point to several instances of that throughout, just like I mentioned with Tocharian. Certainly there was an Indo-European language, but it's not spoken by genetically Indo-European people anymore. It's spoken by local people from Central Asia. And now, thanks to these recent papers, we can be quite certain that they belong to this general group of languages that have a specific typology within Central Asia. So Yenisei, or perhaps more exactly old Proto-Samoyedic, close to that. So again, these are questions like, where could that have happened? In what context? What was going on socially for people to that were probably hunter-gatherers or whatever Proto-Uralic was, because then we need to discuss with that what was going on in that region then, and we only learned that from talking to archaeologists. Yeah.
Right. So I have a hypothesis. I want to get your input on that.
Yes.
So my my observation is that morphology does not change very fast. So when in a Creole, there's no new morphology. So to have something like Proto-Indo-European, where you have prefixes, suffixes, you have roots, you have noun cases, all of that, that takes a really, really long time. And language groups take to go beyond the duration of time for traceability requires isolation for a very, very long time. So most of these language groups formed in Ice Age refugia. So this is my hypothesis. So, for example, the Sino-Tibetan, it happened in East Asia, where there's near Korea, it's ice-free. In Georgia, south of Caucasus, between the two mountains, it was warm. In Iberia, it was warm. And of course, all of India was warm. Because I think my estimate, which is not scientific, is that it takes, 4,000 to 6,000 years of isolation for the hunter-gatherer, the Creole, whatever, to become a uniform morphology. So just your thoughts on that.
Right. Well, I love these discussions. I love these questions because, frankly, we cannot tell. Because just like I said, and this is the space between the linguistic evidence, basically, where we can talk about everything, and I love it. So the evidence that we have is that we have an Indo-European language family. We have a Sino-Tibetan language family. So in that sense, yeah, we can put that wherever. How did they form? We don't know a lot about that. But what I really love to do is to say, we know that Proto-Indo-European is at least 5,000 years old. But we also know that Proto-Turkic is only, from what we're confident with, 2005, so half that age. And then you could go back to Sino-Tibetan, again, east of that, at least 5,000 years old, probably older still. So you actually have Turkic as a very young one in between that. So that's not back to the Ice Age where this particular language family was formed. But Turkic, you can, put into the whole context of transuration or Altaic or however you want to put it. And again, talking about how much of this is contact induced, how much of this is because they have a shared proto-transuration language. And that's exactly one of those really big issues that are like my main supervisor, Martine Robets, down in Jena, is looking into that. And she has a concrete hypothesis that we then can start testing. And the points of criticism is always, there's no is there enough regularity in this? I mean, for Proto-Indo-European, there is enough regularity. We know that's a language family. For Sino-Tibetan, there's enough regularity. We know it's a language family. It's different, but what is going on? We can see that is in your terms, again, a language family forming, but after the Ice Ages. So like I just alluded to earlier, is that I think that we can see some very early loanwords in what becomes Proto-Turkic from this Afanasyevo migration. Again, this is by seeing Turkic as downstream for whatever was happening earlier with Indo-European and Sino-Tibetan on the other hand. And that's why these cultural transformations and these particular cultural loanwords that a lot of them so it's the spread of metallurgy, the spread of the domesticated horse, we can date that in space and time. And then again, with the difficulties, a point I did not mention earlier is that there's no, ironclad, like we can say that there's regularity to prove that there's an Indo-European language family. I cannot prove by linguistic means. I cannot prove that there was a borrowing. I can substantiate it. And what I particularly look at, again, like words that are likely to have been borrowed at a particular point in time when that item or that phenomenon was spreading, or when we can see it popping up in very many different language families where we already believe that those stages were contemporaneous. So that's why I'm here. I want to learn about this space, and I want to discuss these different ideas. So I think I am a hunter-gatherer kind of historical linguist. Not that I'm not interested in it, but because that's not my expertise. I haven't looked into those dynamics there, but I'm very curious about it. Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so I have a question about the regularity or regular correspondence, regular changes, as they're called. You gave the example of P becoming F when you move from, when you move into Germanic.
Yeah.
Are these changes reversible, or is there like some kind of law of physics or law of nature
No,
that
it's not.
prevents
It's
you
not a
from?
law of physics, and we can see it. There are plenty of examples that we can point to. It's relatively rare, but actually in Danish, as part of this whole centralization that we saw across Europe as like nation states formed, that you wanted to have like a one unitary language, and all the poor dialects, they kind of just were wiped out of schools and everything. And there was, like in Swedish, like in the Satem languages, including in the Iranic, of course, is that there was a palatalization happening within Danish, but Danish is still like it reversed that. So if you look at, I'm in a town called Kerteminde with a clear K at the beginning, but when you look at the newspaper that was founded some 150 years ago, it was called Kerteminde with the J, with the glide, that were actually pushing the velar sound further forward in the mouth to anticipate this fronted E vowel. And again, this can sound a lot very technical, but absolutely that there is. But again, here we have the social context for that, and we should also always recall that language is a cultural artifact, and it's something we constantly negotiate in any social setting, and it's not like genes perfectly transmitted. So if you have a hearing impairment, then you can't pronounce the words the way that your parents pronounce them because you can't hear them. But usually you're not going to see that on the longue durée kind of scale, because it's a whole community that will be, passing this and this sound on. But yeah, in principle, well, they are reversible, but they. I wonder if there are any like really good language group wide examples, or if you can find think of any, if there are anything in particular that you're curious about. And also what I of course would love to do, because again, I'm not an expert in any branch of what I consider myself an expert in, is interrogating and with the knowledge that I have about these linguistic processes. So I'd love to take any of these questions, and believe me, I do, to the the different branch experts, and we say, okay, how can we explain this, or whatever, a potential loan word, whatever that we've been discussing. That's basically
Right. So one example could be, Bangani has some it has
it
Kenton
looks
words.
like it has velars, right? And from the data that we have, and
Could that be a reverse? Could that be a sound law going backwards? Is that a possibility?
That to me that sounds very implausible. But there are a lot of things that are just so fascinating with what we believe we have heard about Bangani, and you can read all about the back and forth and just the research history of that. And this is particularly because that's where you extended your invitation to this chat, was after there was to talk about Bangani. And I've been like, every expert I know about like the Indo-Iranic languages, they're so fascinated by it, and they're like, please somebody give us more data that we can actually work on, because there's not that much. And the very curious thing is that these are not cultural words. Like, these are central vocabulary. And the weirdest thing is that vocabulary is not in a Kentum branch of Indo-European. It's a Pahari kind type language, right?
Right.
So we know that that's very much downstream from the Indic branch of Indo-European. So they went through all these sound changes. It is like, if it is an Indo-European language, which again it very well could be, it's a substrate. But why would a substrate show up in the word for liver or to be born, which are usually the words that we expect to be carried there? So that's why, again, Bangani is one of the most fascinating little a question still lingering there, and how to solve it or move forward on it. All the linguists I talk to say, go out there, do more field research, let us get more data so we can properly analyze it, because again, we need the regularities to it. And
right. So as you said, it is you find the the velars in hyper conserved words, like words for tears and liver and so on. That's a good point. So there is some mystery there. So the reason I ask this is if the sound laws are reversible, then this entire concept of a tree, language tree, collapses, because you can, when the laws are reversible, you can do what's called a tree rotation. So if you, if, for those who are not familiar, for the audience who may not be familiar with the concept of a tree, the way it's drawn in linguistics is a directed tree, which means there's an arrow, and it can only go from parent to children. The moment there is no arrow, you can pick any node and lift it up. Just think of the tree as ball bearings to which are connected by ropes, and you can just pick any node and lift it up. That will become the root. So I could, if rules are reversible, I could pick any language. I could pick a modern Danish or a modern English and just lift it up and say linguistically, this is the root, because everything is reversible.
Not when they go together and they're bundled, because what often happens is that you see two different sounds becoming one. So one of them, for example, is in the Germanic branch, we see loss of the aspirated series of Proto-Indo-European. That means after that development has happened, you can reverse that because it's collapsed with so basically a B and a BH would just become B's both. So
but why can't it split on that? If it collapses, why can't it split again if the laws are reversible?
Well, it can split again because it already happened. You can see that has happened in Germanic.
No, because we see today in some Indo-Iranian languages, like how they say the vowel series have collapsed in Sanskrit. Like the first vowel often is a, and it used to be a in Greek. You see in certain Indo-Iranian, in certain Indo-Aryan languages, the first vowel is now again a. So, for example, Romani is a good example. The vowels have diverged, and Romani we know is a very recent migrant, and they have the vowels have split. So if the vowels can merge and split, the aspirated can merge and split, right? So that means if the changes are reversible, then there is no such thing as a tree anymore. Like you cannot determine that this is the root anymore.
Right, but this is a really good example of where you can where the whole tree that we're obviously looking at, because and an important point here, by the way, also in terms of methodology and everything, Indo-European is quite unique because there's no doubt that there's an Indo-European language in Ireland and there's one in India, and they spread over a vast area. That doesn't happen very often. We also have it in Bantu, and we have it in the Austronesian languages. But for most other language families, and also for different stages of Indo-European, we will see dialects being close to each other and see different developments and different. If you have a development in dialects that are close to each other, you can see you could have the neighboring language say, well, now that gained some sort of upper hand, or however you want to put it. And that could reverse that kind of process that they were already going through, like saying all vowels becoming A. Oftentimes we can see that there could be some retention. This is where I'm not an expert in this particular case with the Romani languages. But if it would have been a direct reflex of what we reconstruct the Proto-Indo-European vowel system, that would be really interesting if they could end up with that. So a complete split in the basically E, A, and O vowels there. You would have to send me an article explaining that, and then I would obviously take that to any of my experts in that. But no, what we of course know is that the Germanic language, like the Scandinavian languages with Danish, and there's clear branching, even though they're close to each other, and that all happens, in the dialect continuum. Same thing goes for the Romance language. Same thing goes for the Indian languages and the Iranic languages. But all of this, like close contacts between diversifying dialects, models the picture, and that is a discussion that's been happening for 200 years. How to tell, like this wave model apart from the tree structure. and this is something I've been discussing very honestly with all of my colleagues, of course, is that the tree structure only emerges when there is, where the branches go far enough away from each other that they don't constantly affect each other.
Right. So that's a good point, because linguistics itself has a concept of borrowings and reborrowings. Like somebody borrows and it changes, and the changed word is reborrowed into the source. So for at least, but that seems to be for a minority of words, and for the majority, the tree structure can so you can say it's not a pure tree structure, but there's enough of a tree structure with some back borrowings. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and generally, yeah, and like the counter example, or like the language family where we have issues with this is like take Northeast Caucasian or Cordvillian, like language families that have been in place and must have been in place for a very long time, and there are like a lot of different languages there, but they're basically neighbors. It's so difficult to tell apart, because the isogloss lines are just run wild. Like it's not clear that if they ever really separated. And one innovation, even though they started spreading, like doing different things for 1,000 years, if they're still neighbors, then the next innovation could affect both those groups, even though they had been apart for thousands of years. Like they had done their different things. And that's really where it's difficult to tease this tree-like structure apart. And frankly, that's where I want to use the kind of methodology that Haggerty et al. is using. But I mean, like, they're more than welcome to do it on Indo-European as well, because it's a fun discussion to have. But I'm really curious about Caucasian also because it is so central to everything happening, and any hypothesis, any idea, the classical ideas that's been discussed in Indo-European studies was at least until the advent of ADNA, and now we're reframing all of these discussions, was between Anatolia and the steppe. And what's right between Anatolia and the steppe? Well, you have the Caucasus. If we can find out if there are any cultural loanwords one direction or another, and Armenian must have been in that region, when? Like, if we can get a clear idea of that relative chronology, like the calibration points, like the point about calibration points that I made earlier in my introduction, then we can learn a lot more. So I really want to, push everybody to do like their, meticulous study of the individual languages. So we have the data to do the comparative analysis and reconstruct the different language families, and then try to see how that fits and how it fits the different hypotheses that we have out there.
Right. So one of the things, you mentioned, substrate, superstrate, and so on. One of the things I was always curious about was, how did retroflex consonants get into Nordic languages? Like Swedish has retroflex. I'm not sure if Danish has. And the recent, I guess the recent position is that the Indo-Aryan got retroflex through the Rookie law. So what is your idea about how these? So let me put it into context. So my question is there like a principle of linguistics that regenerates the same things over and over? Like, does palatization happen, in multiple places? Does retroflex generation happen in multiple places?
That's a good point. That there are certain sound laws that are easier, because they're just, again, and that's something I also could have included, but you have to keep it tight. We don't have all night. But it's all about economics, basically, because we constantly talk, and some people talk more than others. This is how we communicate. So within those contrasts, and that's why we're not using the whole, like gamut of different sounds that we can make. But if we can, I mumble a lot, but if people still understand what I'm saying, that means I'm not using as much energy on pronounce. I'm just going to turn on some lights here. I'm not going to be using as much energy to convey the same, like amount of meaning. And that's basically one of the defining features of language, like how languages change internally, at least. Like the internal process is that, well, we're going to try to communicate as much as possible with as least effort as possible. And of course, these are minute changes. But if I don't have to put my tongue in as an extreme position as an E or an U would be, well, then I'm going to be saving energy to do other things, basically. So that's just the internal. What my focus is, of course, and the internal structure and the internal processes is what the entire internal structure of language families or the established language families are based on. What I'm so curious about is like all these external factors that also have, and it's recognized that there's no language in the world that doesn't take loan words. And we can see all of these different examples of how when a group of speakers of one language start learning the next, their the structure of their language will be influencing the next. And that's a really interesting sign about the social dynamics of that place and time, and we should use when we're trying to triangulate and plot these language families onto this prehistoric map.
So I think that actually, it's something that also I was very fascinated about, is that economy or economics, right, is definitely a driving factor. It's in all processes of life. If your body doesn't need a certain organ, it becomes smaller and smaller and disappears.
Yeah.
So it could be the same with speech, like you just said, that if I don't have to make this much effort to convey the same meaning, then I will stop using it. That is, I think that could create a new kind of language tree, or the sound law set of sound laws that defines changes in terms of energy saved. And that could be a very powerful metric to say this change is more likely than the other change. And it also enables you to say, hey, these vowels had to differentiate because now this population moved to a place where they are surrounded by these other languages, where if they don't differentiate these languages, there would be confusion. So I think that is a great research area, and it would
I think it's important to say that all of these elements are within the individual brand specific studies, or just one scientist looking at these things. And what I try to do is to say that all of this complexity, all of these dynamics can be plotted on. And obviously we'll start right now where we're speaking now together, because now we're sure about the context. As we move further back in time, perhaps we're losing some social context, we're losing some of the linguistic evidence, but oftentimes we'll have some of the pieces to this puzzle. And then at some point, well, we know that there must have been this Proto-European language or this Proto-Uralic language. When and where was that spoken? That's a constant back and forth discussion between, the relative chronology of the language trees vis-a-vis the the actual people, the material culture that we know. And we now learning a lot about migrations and interaction, intermarriage, or however you want to put it. It's not always marriage, it's not always benign, but most of the time, which I also think it's a wonderful story to tell when we look at these loanwords. Well, they didn't kill each other at first sight, because otherwise they did not hear about that word. Like they couldn't have adopted that word if they just killed each other at first sight. Well, they could have killed each other after they, exchanged a few glosses, but it's usually because people move around and people try to find ways to coexist. Obviously, there's a lot of conflict going on, but part of the story is also that people communicate with each other even though they speak different languages and they pick up different things. And we can see that signal today, and that's what we're trying to, interpret in the context of everything else.
Right. So, I have one more question before we go to this, spread of people and so on. That is the concept of calques, right?
Yeah.
So recently I read an article that said the word for broadband is been calqued, and it can be reconstructed as Proto-Indo-European, because of this, because of the, the components they used. So if that is the case, how do we know that any kind of linguistic paleontology has not been influenced by calques in the, from the Bronze Age or the Iron Age? Because we don't have attested words from any of that time.
Right. It's basically it's the interpretation of it. And that's why we go with nobody has all the answers on their own. So there are a lot of ways that you can say for certain that is not so a loan word is a one, like if it's an actual loan word where you can see that it doesn't have an intrinsic meaning within the borrowing language, then that's not a calque, of course, and then they must have been. But so a specific example, I guess, would be the word for wheel, which is something that's often discussed, and as it should be, because we're trying to figure out what's going on. There's no doubt that there was, because it follows the regular sound laws. A point that you made earlier, and I think I didn't really, which I like as well, and again, something I bring up, is that you could have, especially when, you know, like the dialect groups are still close together before they probably form branches, or before they have what I would call the diagnostic sound changes, because that, you know, the D to T didn't happen like the day after what became Germanic left Proto-Indo-European. Like it could have happened 1,000 years later. That's just one of the very diagnostic sound changes. That means that if something was borrowed from another dialect within those 1,000 years before they had that diagnostic sound change, then yeah, that could be a word that we cannot then properly reconstruct to Proto-Indo-European. So that's why I like to talk about parameters, and it very much ties back into this whole horse question, that yes, there was a word for horse, but what kind of a horse was that? And then when we look at within Iranic, there is a word that is innovated that I believe was the word that was borrowed into Old Chinese. Well, that tells us, and that general, you know, time frame fits when we know that the domesticated horse started spreading from the steppe zone into China and into Europe, where that same word also appears to show up. Well, then we're recontextualizing what was the meaning of this horse word in the European. So I'm very much joining anybody like criticizing it. What I don't like to do is throwing the baby out with the bathwater, of course, to say that nobody has all the answers. Anthony and his the horse to wheel and language did not have all the answers. Renfrew did not have all the answers, but I'm very much using Renfrew because it's clear that with the advent and the spread of the Neolithic, which we now know genetically also spread, like just pretty much monolithically, like the people from Southwest Asia, not intermarrying, not interbreeding with hunter-gatherers of Europe, they probably spread a significant language as well. So we're going to take that into this whole box of prehistory and try to interpret that along with it. There are reasons why that's very unlikely to have been Proto-Indo-European, which is why that's been abandoned. And even Renfrew himself was like, okay, that part of my hypothesis we can now abandon. The big question is like, yeah, what else? Then what did happen? Where was Anthony wrong? What is he right about? What is right about, you know, all these different dates for all these different innovations? And yeah.
Right. So I think you hit the same point that I was making earlier, is that language persistence for many millennia is a feature of urbanized societies, or at least settled societies.
Well, depending on how stable they are, because I don't know if, yeah, well, I don't know. Can we? What are the best examples of various? Like, I guess some of the most stable you would go to China and look at Chinese, like Chinese has been there at least for 3 millennia, pretty much uninterrupted. Apart from that, well, we know Egyptian lasted pretty long, but now it's gone. Like Coptic is completely gone, and we know the social context of that. You know, like the spread of Arabic. So we know how that died out. We know. What else?
No, I didn't mean the language itself. I meant the stability of the language. You know, the rate of change.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Point. Yeah.
So I think you're right that if you look at the languages that have been attested for a long time, they have some agricultural terms. So essentially, they have settled. People have started living into their 50s. There are grandparents who can speak to the kids, so that the language change is not very rapid, right?
Right.
So so when I look at the steppe hypothesis, the steppe folks were essentially pastoral people with an average group size of 72. 72 is the average.
When are we talking about? What are we? So
we're talking about 4000 BCE, when
right. So 4000 BCE is when that's the domestication of the horse. Now we're not talking language, of course. Now we're just saying this is when we see the horse being domesticated in the steppe zone. That's the libretto.
Right. Yeah, I'm looking at the conditions of the population in that zone, like how many people are there, how are they organized, and so on. And it looks like there are very small settlements. Most of these groups have, each settlement has about 70 people on average. It ranges from 20 to 200.
I'm very curious. So this is like, again, because I'm asking these questions because I'm not completely sure about how and when and exactly. So this is, are we talking like structures like Archaim and Sintashta? Because I know for like the preceding stages with like Yamnaya, it's like it's difficult because they were probably moving around and it's difficult to find out how, like, what kind of settlements they actually had, and often it's just the graves. And so
look, it's pretty straightforward. When you're pastoral, you're not actually settled because your animals are eating the grass, and the grass is gone. You have to move. And the most of the the settlements, the so-called big settlements, are winter shelters. They were only populated in winter. In summer, they would have to go graze their animals. Otherwise, they would die. So, and in general, even today, pastoral groups have a size of 72, and pastoral or hunter-gatherer groups, the dynamics they have is that when they reach the size of around 150, which is called the Dunbar number, so up to the Dunbar number, people can relate to each other because everyone knows everyone individually. They know their names, they know their relationships, and so on. But once it goes beyond that number, the group splits. Okay, this is always the case. So you have the same thing in steppes, and we can see, because we know from the number of sites, the number of graves, the population was about 70 on an average. Somewhere small enough to be 20, somewhere bigger up to 200. And what we see is when there are gaps between each settlement, right? So there's a particular settlement, it dies off, and 200 years later something else comes up. And when we look at the archaeology, the reason most of these guys died is because of a flood. They were settling close to a river, and possibly when they're sleeping, it flooded and it's gone. And of course, it's not a tropical region. So if it's too cold, they could die. If the animals died, they could die. If there is disease, they could die. So essentially, these were isolated groups of 70 each. And the question is, how could we make a claim that they just went around, conquered everybody?
Well,
so for me, it looks more reasonable. Yeah, for me, it makes more reasonable that people in those days just died. Entire groups died, and these groups just moved into that space.
Out a lot with we're only left with what we got, of course. We know that there was an influx of a steppe population into Europe, and we know that there was and I don't know. And again, that's my question here: is does this count for does this also apply, you think, to the Yamnaya population? Because we can see that there is genetically a movement from people there, which could be connected to this whole, there's not enough grass, moving to Central Asia with the Afanasyevo spread. Again, genetically and archaeologically, that's uncontroversial. Linguistically, of course, there's always a debate to be had. But we know that people from that region, which were pastoralists, moved. So we can see that.
I don't think that's correct, because if you look at the gaps in time, one group dies, 300 years later, another group comes up. So you cannot claim that the prior group created the next group. What actually happens is that...
now we have to take it slow then, because we need to understand what we're discussing then, because obviously this is a big part of what I've heard, what I've read from archaeology, from genetics. So we're questioning this, and let's just slow down the pace. So we're showing.
Let me slow down. Let me explain what I have, what the dates are. So, so essentially,
Afanasyevo is very close to my heart, because it looks to me like it can explain some of the dynamics that we're seeing linguistically. So it's something that we should question there. Of course, I'm very, very curious.
Yeah. So essentially, the steppes region, essentially most of North Eurasia, they didn't have the genetic diversity as Africa or India or something like that, because they are a post-Holocene settlement. Actually, they are post-Younger Dryas settlement, because during the Younger Dryas, which is around 8,000 BCE, most of the North Eurasians died off. Okay, so after it warmed up, people went and settled there. So that population of that entire region is genetically very similar, and they were
Yes.
hunter-gatherers. And when hunter-gatherers
When-
settled,
So again, slowly and give me dates. So like this is obviously prior to the Bronze Age, because they were not hunter gatherers.
correct,
Maya
correct.
people were pastoralists.
Yeah. So this is 8,000 BC, whatever. Like there's, there's younger. There was a cold spell. There was, desertification.
Yeah.
All the rivers dried up. I mean, there's everybody who stayed North Eurasia, they died off. Okay, and then it started warming up slowly, and people from the south, from Anatolia, wherever, from the south, started moving in, and they started colonizing that area again because it's a nice fertile grassland, right? So and there was no settlement in whatever 7,000 BC or whatever. There's no we don't have any settlement, so we have to assume they were hunter-gatherers or something like that.
Right. Yeah. At that point, of course. But we
Right.
talked about 4,000 years ago, right? So,
Yes. So we are,
Yamnaya 1,000 years earlier. Sorry. And at that point, there is pastoralism.
Yeah. So I'm just setting the genetic context that they're genetically everybody is very similar. And what happens is when there is a settlement, essentially what happens is one group of hunter-gatherers. Oh, by the way, hunter-gatherers, the way they are is they also, when they gather, like let's say they gather like a potato. I'm just giving an example. I know there was no potatoes here. They would take the top of the plant and plant it back again. So that's how eventually it led to agriculture. They knew that it's obvious we should put a seed or the thing will grow up again. So what happened was that different groups settled down, and just because two groups are close to each other or they're genetically similar doesn't mean that they're speaking the same language or they're culturally similar. Just like in Australian Aborigines, Papua New Guinea, Native America, California.
But now we're at the hunter-gatherer stage, of course. And when we're looking at Afanasyevo, again, by archaeologists and geneticists, considered as Afanasyevo being an eastward migration from Yamnaya.
No, they're claiming that. But I'll tell you what, if you look at the carbon dates, Afanasyevo is earlier than Yamnaya. Okay. So I can share. Yeah. Afanasyevo is earlier by about 200, 300 years. So when they put the dates of Yamnaya, they have to stretch it back because otherwise they won't get published, and they have to play down Afanasyevo. But carbon dating is a big gap. Anyway, we will discuss that because I don't have the references, so I don't want to go into that.
I'll run it past the geneticists, of course.
Right. So my point is that different groups settle down, have a group of 70 to average of 72 people. And just because they are all...
Now, are we back 4,000 BC where they're no longer hunter-gatherers but pastoralists?
Yes, they're no longer hunter-gatherers, but every time somebody settles... So what I'm saying is every group that settles is unlikely to be related to another group that settles 300 years later, 300 miles away. There is no... Because, see, look at their pottery is different. Their clothes are different. Most things are different.
If that's the case. Because of course, and I'm very straightforward about this. I'm not the expert in any of this. I'm related. I'm reading archaeology papers. I'm reading genetics papers, and I'm talking to the experts and asking, is this really so? Is it true that there is a continuation? Is it believed that Afanasyevo? And this is what I hear, and now I'm getting from you.
Yes.
And I never asked. And again, we're having a very good faith argument here. So yes. I'm not prying. I'm just. What is your background for saying that? Because what I really don't want, and that is to say that people are doing that because of some political agenda.
No. I'm not stating that at all.
Why would I get from geneticists and archaeologists that Afanasyevo basically is, and we could like in material culture, it is the introduction of the Bronze Age to Central Asia, and it's a Bronze Age material culture that looks very similar to what is found in Western stuff. That is my appreciation of that. So why would I question that?
No, that's a good point. But but all I'm saying is a couple of things, right? The carbon dates are earlier. The
and obviously I noted that as well, but I also know that, you know, like when we write these numbers, it's circa, it's about, and if we didn't get that date, and perhaps it's rather Sretni Stug than Yamnaya, and you know, all of that back and forth. So,
right.
So the question is, are they completely unrelated, or is there some connection? Is it an eastward movement, or is it a westward movement, or are they unrelated? I guess that's the question.
Right. So my guess is they're unrelated, because the idea that somebody would move from Ukraine, which is a warm place in you know, all of Russia, you know, that area, to Afanasyevo, which is not that warm, and it's so there's more grasses, more climatic stability, everything in Yamnaya, and there, you know, each group is 72 people. They don't have to move there for grass. They don't have to move 3,000. You know, I think it's 4,500 kilometers for grass. They can just move 100 kilometers, and there would be plenty of grass. There's no reason to do that. So that is one, and the idea that
all of this, of course, is premeditated on them not being related. So we have to and again, I'm very happy to post this question again. Yeah. What is why do we posit Afanasyevo as related to Yamnaya, or a slightly earlier, you know, like a predecessor of Yamnaya, and not considering it different? Because at the same time, it is like, do you question that the first pastoralists showed up with cattle that are certainly genetically from Western Eurasia, or question that the first metal objects in Central Asia is from Afanasyevo, and they look similar to the Western Eurasian assemblages?
All right. No, I didn't look at the metal. See, there is always been trade, and so what I don't understand is someone from Yamnaya saying, "Hey, you know what? I have all this nice region. I'm actually in a very pleasant place. It's Ukraine."
Well, actually, that was the big question. And just a year and a half ago, I think, and that's the wonderful thing about being interdisciplinary, was that there was this climate scientist. His name is Christian Leipe, and he was like, "Yeah, right at the end, middle to end of the 4th millennium BC, we see climate fluctuation. So a cold spell across Eurasia." He was talking in this context about China, and then Michel Perrault, who is a Tocharian expert, who is, again, he starts with linguistic evidence, but is also trying to figure out, like, how did Tocharian end up there? And there is the hypothesis of this Afanasyevo migration. Raised his hand, was like, well, that's when they should have started moving. Is that perhaps one of their, you know, like the driving factors? And some of my archaeologist colleagues who were critical and who would like to see Renfrew, because they don't like the idea of, you know, like the horse riders from the steppes, which of course they weren't, because they could not have ridden a horse prior to 2000 BC, basically. We're also like, well, why would they cross the entire steppe zone? Probably if they had gone, they must have gone in like the forest steppe interface, because that's a likelier place. And again, that's still questioning, but also coming up with potential like hypotheses that can then perhaps be tested. And again, we cannot prove these things, but we can see how they fit with all the different data points that we do have. And that's why I love this discussion. So now you.
Right. So my conflict with the steppe hypothesis primarily that there are groups of 72 people, and they are busy, herding their cattle or their animals, and occasionally they raid each other. They're all rivals. They sometimes fight each other. And how is the
competition is a driving force, right? But again,
well, I mean, it's pretty normal, like even today, pastorals kind of raid each other's cattle. We see that in Africa, even today. So the question is, how is this a group of 72 people go and...
So that number, of course, is very curious. Like, so 72, you talk about a Dunbar number being 150, and
yes.
I can't comment on the number 72 because, we're looking
it's a median number. It's a median number, but you can see the size of all settlements. It's, it's public.
Right.
It's 20 to 200. Okay. So even if you take it as 200, the biggest...
Right. So, but like you said, if there's, right. And again, now we're just like, what kind of dynamics were in place? By then we have like a hierarchical society. That is what archaeologists describe in that region.
But there's no hierarchy. There's no hierarchy until urbanization, right? Like in a In a herding society,
not like in
there's
city state, of course. And I think, and perhaps that could be one of the driving factors. Again, speaking hypothetically here, that there is a hierarchy in the sense that some people are burned with a lot of grave goods, others just kind of like disappear into this. So why spend all that, energy, that investment back to the economy of building these burial mounds to show off from other people? What we know from Indo-European, like from just like the linguistic study, because in Greek and in Sanskrit and in Tocharian, we have this concept of name glory or name fame, which is something to aspire to, that there's, you can become something very great for yourself. And specifically, if you have these smaller, groups of people, because they obviously didn't settle in larger settlements in the Yamnaya times. So that probably led to that kind of, like constant competition between them that would, have a spillover effect little by little, again, not by violent conquest, but because the potential for, like gaining riches or like making a name for yourself is there when you have these large cattle, and there's also large herds of cattle with sheep and potentially goats. Going back to, we can't reconstruct the Proto-Indo-European word for goat. Goats are preferable like mountainous areas. Sheep are very nice to have like in great pastures, so there's there we can reconstruct words also for like feasting. So like a feast, whatever that is, a communal sharing or whatever. Again, and now we're back into this old discussion. What was the actual semantics of all of that? So none of this, like there is not a perfect solution to all these things. And what we really should strive for is come up with the most concrete hypothesis and then start testing that with the questions like you're posing, like how could that have happened? To me, I think it's still plausible, but perhaps you have some follow-up questions specifically to that, because of course there are very, very many other dynamics across Eurasia that we need to be able to explain somehow, or should try to find out. Yeah.
Right. So the idea that a group of 200 people somehow, even if they unite a bunch of other tribes, it wouldn't be more than like 1,000, 2,000 people. And out of that, you're going to have about 500, 600 fighting age men. And the claim is made that this small group somehow crossed the Hindu Kush, which is really a death sentence to go without modern oxygen and anything like that, and change the language of 10 million Indians at that time.
That's the thing about conquest, because I think we need to, like, for very many obvious reasons, we need to step away, like back from that, and again go back to the linguistic facts that there are languages spoken across Eurasia that are related. How did they come to spread across Eurasia? Let's not use words like conquest, because now we're back 100 years in the country just south of here. And I'm sure that there are people in Denmark with sympathies going in that direction as well, that there's like this idea that, yes, we're the stronger, like, because language is so tied to identity, and we really don't want to go there.
No, I'm not. I'm not saying conquest. I'm saying somehow they were able
what
to.
What were the dynamics? And I'm completely with you, because that's so fascinating. What could have driven that? And was it entirely impossible? Was it something very unique happening? Because of course the opportunity cost of saying, well, that is completely inexplicable, and now we're reversing, like now we're coming up with different hypotheses, which is, by the way, what Hecate has done. And then that raises a lot of other questions for a lot of other branches that are, from my perspective at least, better explained with the Steppe hypothesis, of course. So that's why like it comes in a package, but it's also a lot of little individual issues that we need to be addressing together. So down into the Hindu Kush, wow, what is going on? That's a really good question. Conquest,
No, I didn't bring up the word conquest. I'm saying
good. I said that. You said military, and then you said
no. It's not military. So people, essentially the claim is that these people came in, a few hundred, maybe couple of thousand, and they changed the language. They renamed the rivers. They changed the topology. They took all the names of the stars. They renamed all these their ancient symbols, and to a point where the old names of all of these are completely erased. Of a civilization of about 10 million people, like 1,000 people did that, right? Within a very, very short time.
Right.
I think this is a very extraordinary claim. And
no, it is, and well, anything regarding linguistics is extreme because it's never one-to-one. It's not just a group of people, except I thought until 10 minutes ago, Yamnaya and Tuafanase, well, that was an easy one, but perhaps it's not. But again, let's go to Europe because we know in Europe, in terms of, we can see like a decimation of the European Neolithic population prior to the slow, or I don't know how fast it was. So let's not use adverbs like that or adjectives like that. But that like the spread of Yersinia pestis, and there was like infighting between Neolithic groups. Perhaps like Europe was being saturated with the kind of Neolithic culture that they had there. And then these little, like if we go by this figure 70, which I think is interesting, and we can tie that into this Männerbunde idea that young men were put into war bands and try like being opportunistic and searching like the fringes of society, probably taking wives. Again, we can see that there's this, like often in Bronze Age Europe, we'll be missing the young women within a family while the rest of the family is still there. Is that it's a dynamic that's probably feeding off a declining Neolithic population in Europe, and some innovations that like just the domestication of the horse. And it's a gradual process that by 2000 BC at least, now they were riding it, but there were horses with people before that as well. And this is again one of the things that I'm so excited to be looking into these years, because we're learning so much, because it's happening across Eurasia within 1,000 years, the spread of this domesticated horse. And that certainly changed the dynamics of the steppe zone. There's no doubt about that. The big question is how is that reflected linguistically? And we can address in South Asia, we can look at the word for horse, where they get the word gota, which is very different from equus word. And why? Because it looks like a borrowing. It looks like it belongs to a different group of words that look similar to other words of Southwest Asia. I think I've alluded to this on Twitter before, but it's in my dissertation as well. And again, my focus has not been South Asia. My focus has not been on Southwest Asia in particular, but Central Asia more generally. But again, like I'm happy to entertain any hypothesis that can explain what is going on there, and I come up with my own ideas, of course, but only for them to be tested and questioned.
Right. So I just want to highlight the word hypothesis, right? And hypothesis essentially is this Maria Gimbuta's hypothesis? Is it so a hypothesis is created from attested evidence, and you collect as much facts as you want as you can, and then you for the things that are missing, you postulate, right? And then you write out a hypothesis.
Yeah. And then you can test it. That's why, again, with maps as a heuristic device, because obviously there are so many details that we don't know anything about, but somehow these regions connected, and now we know that the languages are connected. How did that come to be? Well, here's an attempt, and I can be specific here with like the arrows going through the Balkans, like Greek and Italic don't look like they have very much in common. So in this region, so we probably need to split those arrows apart at the very least, just looking at linguistic evidence. Genetic data, archaeological data, and independent linguistic research was going on. PhD, a good friend of mine, was looking into Armenian and the words that they had shared with particularly the Caucasian language groups. And he suggested that, well, it looks like Armenian actually, like they must have gone through the Caucasus. And that was a complete reversal of, like the standard thinking just 5 years ago, because there are also innovations within Greek and Albanian that appear to be shared with Albanian. And you may have heard that Herodotus said that, like the Phrygians and the Armenians were closely related. So the idea was that they traversed Anatolia, but it was not clear, like there's no sign of that really. Okay, and then from my perspective, looking at what are the potential loan words within Armenian, Albanian, and Greek, again, there are words that look similar to Caucasian languages. And that was, for me, again, I didn't know any better because people have been saying that they must have been in the Balkans. I was like, okay, well, were there Caucasian speakers there? Again, questions that were constantly prodding at this hypothesis. How could that make sense? Looking at genetics, looking at whatever. But then when he said that, if they went through the Caucasus, then they didn't go across Anatolia. Could Greek and Albanian have been close to Armenian up here? Well, we don't have any evidence of any language groups here that could have been in the way. So basically what we're now looking at is what we call the Balkanic branch of Indo-European, was probably spoken north, was never in the Balkans. It only came there later. And that, of course, would explain how, like cultural loanwords from the Caucasus could have ended up there, which makes me a happier camper. But that is exactly because new data is being put out there. And again, if there's a different hypothesis that can, explain these phenomena, then I'm equally a happy camper, because it's fun when when we can, completely change our view of prehistory based on a new way of looking at it. And if I can just come with one more example of how things have changed, this also within my research, was that the word for horse, and I've alluded to this earlier, in Old Chinese was marak, how they reconstructed there based on the dialects and the old early ways of writing it, had been compared to the Celtic and Germanic word markos, which is also the word we still see in mare today, and marshal. So that was in Celtic and Germanic. It was then hypothesized that it was from Tocharian languages, borrowed into Chinese, since perhaps there was a Proto-Indo-European word for that. Well, you could pry into that, because first of all, it's not attested in Tocharian. They use the word yakwe, which is from Equus, which is also where Ashwa is from, of course. And the word for Marcos, if you ask Celticists and Germanicists, they say, no, it looks borrowed. It must have been borrowed between those two. And they probably got it from the steppes, but again, not very concrete, because nobody really knew what was happening there. Now, of course, it makes sense because the horse was domesticated from the steppes. That doesn't tell us what language it would have come from. But that kind of, for me, it was like, now I'm questioning this. And again, I really appreciate all the scholars that were explicit about saying perhaps it's from Tocharian, because then I could test that. I could say, if it was from Tocharian, how could we explain that? It's also weird if they came in early with Afanasyevo, where they did not really have a domesticated horse. Why would the Chinese then adopt that, or at least not writing one? And then I was looking into the Iranic words for horse, which I was not that familiar with, but just to say it was more likely that, when the Scythians are when we finally see Scythians in history, they're Iranic speakers, and we know that they rode around on the steppes. So why didn't they borrow one of those words? And apparently there was a word called baraka, and nobody really looked at that before because there's a B instead of an M, but there were sound changes that could account for that. And that, while I was working on that paper with horse genetics came out, and it's like, okay, these pieces are falling into place, but only because people were kind enough and brave enough to be explicit about the hypothesis that it could have been borrowed for Afanasyevo, gave me like the impetus to challenge that and to try to, and I expected it just to be like, oh, it's implausible. We can't connect, Western Eurasia with Eastern Eurasia. But perhaps we can, because that there was a nice bridge there with Iranic. So just to say, I'm very, very interested in any new kind of data that we can, plot into this machine. Nobody knows everything.
So let me try my hand at a hypothesis. So the step hypothesis, I was not able to find anything that outlines it from first principles. The closest thing I have is Gimbuta's, for lack of a better word, feminist theory that, European civilizations were...
It was written in a particular point in time, and also in Europe where everything is politicized, of course.
Right. Yeah. It was, so from first principles, if I were to derive a hypothesis, I would say a language, when it's attested earliest, is probably closer to its origin. Okay. So if you look at English, it's attested earliest in England, and if you look at, and so on.
But that's just historical accidents, of course, because writing is a cultural, innovation that comes later. The Uralic languages, of course, are only become attested as they enter the, the zone of, Europe, where.
Agreed. So I'm just giving an example of a hypothesis from first principles, right? So. From my perspective, the earliest attested IE is Indus inscriptions, which are, I have deciphered to be Sanskrit. The second earliest
that's of course controversial, as you know, but I would love to.
I'm just giving that as one data point.
Yes.
The second is the Sanskrit words in Sumerian inscriptions in 2200 BC. The third is the Mitanni Prakrit in about 1800 to 1400 BC.
Right.
1800 we have Hittite, and then we have also Mitanni from 1800 to 1400. So if you look at that, many of these are attested before some of the key spreaders like Sintashta or Androno even existed.
Right. Absolutely. So that's exactly why I'm so curious about this discussion. And and I know you recognize that, otherwise we wouldn't be sitting here. I'm curious about that. I'm asking other experts in the Indic languages and the Middle East about okay, what about this decipherment? So the thing about loanwords that we already talked about earlier is that there are some, they can be really difficult to prove. I think the naming stuff where you have a lot of words that look similar and you can correlate that. That's really interesting. Let's look at the dating of that. But also what we discussed earlier in terms of loanwords in Sumerian. First of all, naming material like names are inherently more difficult than words because a lot of different factors can play in. Again, this is just setting the parameters. It means that they're still there. It's just that they could also be interpreted differently. So it has to be, again, this is one part of the entire thing where we also need to take care of Tocharian and Greek and Germanic, of course. What was the last point I wanted to make here? Yeah, and the last thing about the similarities between names in Sanskrit and potentially in Sumerian is if it's common, like if it's from a third source, of course. And we discussed this online, and I really love to posit that. I'm not in a position to make that claim, but it's in here with okay, then what? Obviously, now it's 6:30, so I think we'll have to continue at some other point. But let's just to wrap this up, of course. What I like and what I'm always asking is try to make a map where we're very explicit about dates and times of spread, because then I can put in, the Balkan subgroup of Indo-European. We can put in the how did early Iranic affect Tocharian, if not from Afanasyevo. So all of that is really I'm very, very keen to explore. So yeah, that makes sense, right?
Right. Yeah, so I do have a map, but it's pretty obsolete. I will create a new map and we can follow maybe in a future discussion.
Yeah, that would be fun. I would really, really enjoy that. Absolutely.
Right. So let's take about 5 minutes to answer the viewers' questions. I selected a few so that we don't burn our time. So one of the questions is, was there really such a thing as Proto-Indo-European? I think this is referring to the fact that when PIE was originally formulated, they made it clear that it was not a real language spoken by real people in a real place at real time. It's just a model for language relationships. So go ahead and give your opinion on that.
So yes and no. That's the best way, because there's no doubt that the regularities will point back to some kind of common source. But the best way to look at it is to look up at the stars, because we see constellations, but the constellations, of course, are only from our perspective. We don't know if this or that development were contemporaneous, but we know that they lie before the earliest point of where these languages came together. And that's why, again, I'm so curious about these. So within the steppe hypothesis, if they were hunter-gatherers on the steppe, they would have known the aurochs, but at some point they would have been introduced to the domesticated cattle. Then there's a space and time for that we can try within the hypothesis and be explicit about. Then that's when they should have borrowed it. Does that make the cart house fall, or does that still fit within the hypothesis, or do we need to make little tweaks to it? So yes, there's no doubt when we talk about an uncontroversial proto-language, there must have been a speech community, and that they spread from. How dialectically diverse it was and what it came from before that. Again, we could easily talk about Creoles or anything before that, but we cannot question the fact. Well, we could question anything, but it's established that Proto-Indo-European existed as a speech community somewhere in the probably Eurasian prehistory, landscape.
Okay. Next question is, have you read the works of Shrikant Alagiri, Nicholas Kazanas? I think this is referring to, are you also open to the
Yeah,
out of India
no,
hypothesis?
absolutely. I'm very open to, and I do my best with the limited time that I have. And again, I would really appreciate, like a concretely like map because I can use that as a heuristic device. Again, I'm not an expert in early Vedic writings and how to date that. There's a tradition that we're building on. I'm very happy to question that, and again, I'm taking all of these inputs to whatever experts that are there, and I'm happy to facilitate any kind of discussion of all of that. So it would be nice for me, because I am that kind of like bring it all together prehistorian with my focus on contact linguistics. To okay, let's look at that map. How would that map look like? And the more explicit we can be about that, and because now I've obviously put up this map exactly because it's very nice to debate from. If you make an updated map, that would be really instructive, interesting to look at. Again, I haven't seen the evidence from reading as much as I did that made me reconsider everything. But again, I'm trying to internalize everything and
right. So yeah, this is a question. You can read it.
Oh yeah, ask him that. Well, again, Reich, I don't know Maya, but Kraus and Haag, they're all geneticists. So Andronova, actually, from my point of view, I think it's ironic. I think Andronova was so late that it's just ironic, and that whatever, within the Steppe hypothesis, also, like you said, with the certain early attestation in Mittani for the Steppe hypothesis to work, the first whatever impulses, if there were people there, probably at least some, they must have, the index speakers must have moved first. That's the only way that I can get that to add up, because, like I said, once the Scythians are show up in history, we know they're Iranic speakers. And from contact linguistics, it looks like there are early loanwords in Turkic and in Chinese that must have been there by 1200 BC. And that's exactly when we see the horse spreading from the steppe zone into East Asia. So I'd say that Andronova is rather Iranic than Indo-Iranic. And then again, what was the vehicle for Indic? That's a really good question.
All right. So given that Mittani is actually Prakrit, not Indo-Iranian or Indo-Aryan. Well,
that's
the
about
is in Aryan, but
dialectal variation, and
it's actually Prakrit, and it's the words are post-classical Sanskrit. Like the name Birasena, it has several Prakritizations. The V to B, the shortening of the I, the name with the affix Sena is from the Mahabharata times. It doesn't exist before that. So would that throw a monkey wrench into the Steppe hypothesis?
Everything throws a little wrench in somewhere, right? And that's why we're trying to focus on it. And again, mustering the expertise that is needed to address that properly, which is not me. But absolutely, that's something I'm very happy to explore. I'd be surprised that people who studied, because there are plenty of scholarly articles on that. And again, that's why I need to figure out, like, why wouldn't scholars who've looked at that before, why wouldn't that have been the case? And that's why I can't use Twitter alone. Like obviously this is where ideas are generated, but they need to be formulated and vetted by experts, and that's why we have that system in place, of course. But I'm very curious about all of this.
Right.
Yeah.
So we'll take this as the last question. I think this is about genetics. So if you don't want to answer it, it's fine. But essentially, he's asking that Steppe MLB, Steppe Neolithic ancestry came into India around 500 BCE, and how does that square with the Steppe hypothesis?
I think this is a very nice way to end, in the sense that I'm gonna insist that I'm gonna end on the linguistic evidence, because now we're looking at genetics, and obviously that is what we'll be discussing linguistic evidence with again. But what we can see in terms of the the biggest what is it, like the hotspot of Indic, like close to Nuristani, of course, is in northern India, and so it looks like whatever happened when it happened, and again, there's no data on the linguistic material until I managed to show when different loanwords showed up, where that can be dated. But there's no data on that, so it looks like whatever it came in from that region. So how to interpret that genetically? There's no doubt that we're looking at, like with the Steppe hypothesis, but also without the Steppe hypothesis, that there was, like the retroflexes, like it's only in the Indic branch that they have that. So it looks like that's a regional feature that they adopted there, because we don't see that in the Iranic languages. So it looks like that's a feature adopted in that region. But what, of course, we don't know too much about. And again, it would be wonderful if you already deciphered the Indus Valley script. But we also have a lot of, we have Dravidian, of course, but we have Munda. And we have Burushaski. I'm very, very, very interested in Burushaski. And I think that we have some new, like dates that we can use for that, like in terms of contact linguistics, specifically the word for grape, but I'm not gonna bore you with that now. But all of that goes into the interpretation. And of course, Indic is one branch, but it needs to, we need to be able to account for the data and all the stuff that you said that I can't answer to directly because I'm not an expert in it. I'm very happy to explore further with experts, and I'll posit it to them, and I will do that on Tuesday when I speak to one of them. So,
right. So that's great, and I think I can definitely create another map with the attestations and
wonderful
literature, and then we can have
use maps as heuristic devices
right,
to facilitate this kind of discussion. It's very stimulating.
Right, and we can have a another discussion. We can pick it up from where we left off. Thank you for coming. This has been great. It's very hard to get any linguist to come on YouTube for some reason, but you've been good sport. You've been brave, I suppose. And,
well, I guess some of my colleagues would say that too, but I'm very honest about it. And some people, perhaps myself as well, would call me naive. But I'm like, you know what? Nobody knows everything. We're all here to learn together. We're learning so much with new data points coming out every week. Let's try to put it together somehow. Very exciting times.
It was a great session, and hopefully we'll have more of this. Talk to you again next time. Thank you, Rasmus.
Take care. Good night.
Bye.